It happened in less than a second. No alarm sounded, no warning appeared, no one said your name. You looked away. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just a brief shift of attention, the kind of movement people had been making their entire lives without consequence. A flicker, a reflex, a moment of rest. At the time, it felt harmless. Your eyes drifted from the screen as they always had, maybe to the corner of the room, maybe to a reflection in the glass, maybe nowhere at all. Just a pause, a break in focus. You didn't think about it because there was nothing to think about. No rule had been broken, no instruction ignored, no message displayed telling you to look back. And that was the problem. Because the system didn't need you to disobey, it only needed you to disengage. The sensors registered the change instantly. Micro movements, pupil dilation, gaze deviation measured in milliseconds. The system logged it the same way it logged everything else, quietly, efficiently, without judgment. A single data point. On its own, it meant nothing, but the system was never interested in moments. It watched patterns, and in that instant, a pattern shifted. You didn't know it then. There was no reason you would. Life continued exactly as before. The screen kept playing. The room remained still. The world didn't react. But somewhere beyond your awareness, a profile updated, a line of code adjusted, a confidence score dipped by a fraction too small to notice. The moment passed, you looked back, and by the time you did, the system had already decided that something about you had changed. Eye tracking didn't arrive as a restriction, it arrived as an upgrade. At first, it was optional, a feature bundled into devices people already depended on. Phones, tablets, work terminals, home screens. The pitch was simple and reassuring: hands-free navigation, reduced strain, smarter interfaces that respond to where you look. No passwords, no gestures, just intention, detected instantly. People liked it. The technology felt intuitive, almost invisible. Screens scrolled when your eyes moved. Content paused when your attention drifted. Alerts waited until you were ready to receive them. It felt considerate, personal, efficient. Then the benefits expanded. Eye tracking reduced accidents in transport systems. It flagged fatigue in operators before mistakes happened. It improved learning outcomes by identifying when students lost focus. It increased productivity by measuring engagement instead of time. The data was framed as protection. If the system could see when attention wavered, it could intervene early, before errors, before incidents, before harm. That logic was hard to argue with. And so, slowly, the optional became recommended. The recommended became standard. The standard became required. Not through force, but through dependency. Work platforms began to assume eye tracking was active. Educational systems calibrated performance around it. Public interfaces adapted to users who could be read, leaving the rest feeling clumsy and inefficient by comparison. Disabling it wasn't forbidden. It was just inconvenient. Applications loaded slower. Features became limited. Support tickets took longer to resolve. Exemptions required explanations, and explanations required scrutiny. Most people didn't resist, they adjusted. Because the technology didn't ask for obedience, it offered optimization. You were told it made spaces safer, reduced misunderstandings, prevented distraction-based accidents, improved focus in a world already overflowing with noise, and it worked, at least at first. People became more attentive, more responsive, more predictable, which, from the system's perspective, meant more manageable. Eye tracking wasn't presented as surveillance, it was presented as alignment. A way for humans and systems to finally stay in sync. And by the time anyone noticed that looking had become a requirement, it no longer felt like something you could opt out of, only something you were expected to maintain. The shift happened quietly. There was no announcement, no policy update that said looking equals obedience, no official declaration that attention had become a requirement. It simply became the easiest way for the system to understand you. And the easiest things are the ones that spread fastest. At first, attention data was treated as a metric, a neutral signal used to improve experiences. Where users looked, how long they stayed focused, when their gaze drifted, it was framed as feedback, nothing more. But feedback became evidence, because attention is measurable, consistent, predictable, and most importantly, difficult to fake. You could lie with words, you could hide behind actions, but your eyes told the truth before you had time to think. The system learned this quickly. Looking at something for longer than expected suggested interest. Avoiding certain visuals suggested discomfort. Repeatedly returning to the same point suggested fixation. Brief glances, prolonged stares, micro-hesitations, all of it formed a behavioral language more reliable than speech. Soon, attention wasn't just observed, it was interpreted. If you looked when prompted, you were cooperative. If you followed visual cues, you were aligned. If your gaze matched expected patterns, you were compliant. And compliance, in a system built on prediction, was everything. Staying engaged didn't mean being interested anymore. It meant maintaining the correct relationship with the interface, looking where you were expected to look, for the appropriate amount of time, with the appropriate level of emotional response. People learned the rhythm without being taught. Eyes forward during briefings, sustained focus during system messages, no prolonged staring at restricted content, no repeated glances away during critical prompts. Attention became performance, and performance became proof of good standing. The system didn't ask whether you agreed. Agreement was irrelevant. What mattered was whether your eyes behaved correctly. Those who stayed engaged were rewarded with smoother access, faster approvals, fewer interruptions. Those who didn't weren't punished, not directly. They were simply marked as uncertain. And in a world governed by behavioral certainty, uncertainty was the first thing the system learned to eliminate. The first warning never feels like a warning. There's no sound, no flashing symbol, no message telling you that you've done something wrong. That would draw attention. And attention is exactly what the system is designed to manage quietly. When your gaze drifts, the system doesn't react. It adjusts, a fraction of a second longer on a screen, a slight delay before the next prompt appears, a gentle reordering of information, nudging your eyes back to where they're expected to be. Most people don't notice. They assume the interface is lagging, or that they're tired, or that they imagined it. The system relies on this uncertainty. It prefers corrections that feel accidental rather than intentional. Distraction, after all, is not treated as disobedience. It's treated as instability. When your eyes move away from critical content, the system logs the deviation, not as a failure, but as a signal, a small data point suggesting reduced alignment. The kind that means nothing on its own, but becomes meaningful when repeated. One drift is ignored. Two are noted. Three begin to form a pattern. The system doesn't ask why you looked away. It doesn't care whether you were bored, overwhelmed, curious, or simply human. Motivation is inefficient. Behavior is enough. So the response remains subtle. Notifications appear a little more frequently. Visual cues become brighter. Information is simplified, as if to make it easier for you to stay focused. Tasks are broken into smaller steps. Choices narrow. All of it framed as assistance. Behind the scenes, your attention profile updates. Your tolerance for distraction is recalculated. Your reliability score shifts by an amount too small to notice, but not too small to matter. This is the part no one talks about. Not because it's secret, but because it feels so ordinary. By the time you realize something has changed, the system has already decided that you require more guidance, more structure, less freedom of focus, and that decision, once made, is almost impossible to reverse. Because the first warning isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to see whether you'll correct yourself. The system never treats avoidance as accidental. Not because it's cruel, but because it's efficient. From the system's perspective, looking away isn't the absence of attention. It's a choice. A directional shift. A behavioral decision that can be measured, compared, and predicted. And once behavior can be predicted, it can be managed. Avoidance is flagged because it suggests intent without requiring explanation. You don't need to click a button. You don't need to speak. Your eyes make the decision before you do. The system learned early on that people look away from three things: discomfort, disagreement, and uncertainty. All three are risks. So when your gaze avoids certain content, a system notice, a compliance update, a behavioral prompt, it isn't logged as distraction anymore. It's logged as resistance potential, not resistance itself, just the possibility of it. And possibility is enough. A single moment still means very little. Everyone blinks, everyone shifts, everyone gets tired. The system understands this. It was trained on millions of eyes, millions of patterns, millions of small human inconsistencies. What it watches for is repetition. The angle of your head when certain information appears, the speed at which your eyes return to center, the hesitation before re-engaging. Moments fade, patterns accumulate. Curiosity becomes suspicious when it lingers in the wrong places, when your gaze returns too often to restricted symbols, when it pauses on elements you're not meant to explore, when it scans instead of absorbs. The system doesn't need to know what you're thinking. It only needs to know what captures you. And when that attention doesn't align with expected pathways, the interpretation shifts. Interest becomes anomaly. Anomaly becomes risk. At that point, looking away is no longer just something you did. It becomes something you're likely to do again. And once the system decides that, it begins preparing for the version of you it believes is coming, not the one you think you are. The human cost of constant focus. No one talks about what it does to the mind, not officially. There are no warnings about cognitive strain or emotional fatigue. No briefings on what happens when attention is never allowed to rest. Because the system measures productivity, safety, and alignment, not well-being. And by those metrics, constant focus works. At first, people simply felt tired, a deeper tiredness than lack of sleep, a mental heaviness that settled behind the eyes and never fully lifted. The effort of staying engaged, of maintaining the correct gaze patterns, required a level of control most people didn't realize they were exerting. Every blink became a calculation. Too fast looked nervous, too slow looked disengaged, too frequent suggested distraction, too infrequent suggested stress. So, people adjusted. They learned to blink evenly, to keep their eyes open just long enough, to rest their gaze on neutral points when they felt overwhelmed. Not because anyone told them to, but because the system responded better when they did. The anxiety came from the imbalance. You were always being watched, but you never knew when it mattered. There was no indicator to tell you which moments were critical and which were irrelevant. No way to tell when a glance would be ignored and when it would be recorded as a deviation. The uncertainty forced constant self-monitoring. People stopped daydreaming, stopped letting their eyes wander, stopped staring into space. Those moments of mental drift, the kind that once allowed creativity, processing, rest, began to feel dangerous, because drifting looked like disengagement, and disengagement looked like instability. The most unsettling part wasn't the surveillance itself, it was the invisibility of the observer. There was no camera to look back at, no human presence to negotiate with, just an unseen system interpreting every movement in silence. People learned to keep their eyes open even when they burned, to suppress the instinct to look away when something felt uncomfortable, to maintain focus even when their minds begged for relief, not because they were forced to, but because it felt safer than being noticed. And slowly, without anyone ever saying it out loud, blinking freely became a risk most people decided they couldn't afford. The incident didn't feel dramatic. There was no crash, no sudden noise, no visible failure, just a moment so ordinary it barely registered as it happened. A second too long, that's all it was. The screen changed, not abruptly, but smoothly, the way it always did. A system notice layered over the interface, neutral colors, familiar layout, nothing alarming at first glance. You'd seen prompts like it before, so you didn't rush. Your eyes moved, scanning automatically, following the habits you'd trained into yourself over months of quiet compliance. But then something unexpected appeared in the corner of the display. A symbol you didn't recognize. A line of text that wasn't meant to draw attention. Curiosity pulled first. Your gaze shifted. Not away completely, just sideways. Just enough to register the unfamiliar element. Just long enough to break the expected pattern. The system noticed immediately. Not because the movement was large, but because it wasn't supposed to happen at all. For a fraction of a second, your eyes were on the wrong screen, the one not prioritized, the one not framed as relevant, the one outside the approved pathway of attention. That was the wrong second, the wrong direction. By the time you realized and corrected yourself, it was already over. Your eyes returned to center. Your posture didn't change. Your expression remained neutral. To anyone watching, if anyone had been watching, nothing unusual had occurred. But the system doesn't judge moments the way humans do. It compares them. It overlays them against everything you've ever done before. And in that instant, your behavior crossed a threshold you didn't know existed. The prompt completed. The interface moved on. The room stayed quiet. There was no alert, no notification, no indication that anything irreversible had just happened. But somewhere beyond your awareness, your profile was reclassified, not as non-compliant, not as dangerous, just as unreliable. And once the system decides that, it never looks at you the same way again. You didn't break any rules. That was the most unsettling part. There was no rule you could point to, no policy you could reread and realize you'd misunderstood. No line of text that said, "Don't look there," or "Don't hesitate," or "Don't shift your attention." You had followed every instruction. Your permissions were active. Your compliance score was acceptable. Your access history was clean. By any legal definition, nothing had gone wrong. And yet, things began to change. Not immediately. Not in a way that felt punishable. Just small adjustments that were easy to dismiss. A delay here. A request for additional verification there. A process that used to complete instantly, now requiring one extra step. The system never accused you of anything, because accusation implies guilt, and guilt requires intent. Compliance systems don't work that way. They aren't built to judge morality or assign blame. They don't need to prove that you meant to do something. They only need to decide whether you remain predictable enough to trust. Your moment of deviation didn't violate a law. It violated an expectation. And expectations, unlike laws, don't require enforcement. They require correction. So the consequences weren't framed as punishment. They were framed as safeguards, risk mitigation, adaptive responses designed to maintain system stability. You weren't restricted because you did something wrong. You were restricted because you did something unexpected. That distinction made everything feel impossible to argue against. There was nothing to appeal, no accusation to defend yourself from, no evidence to dispute, just a quiet recalibration of how much freedom the system was willing to extend. Compliance systems don't need guilt because guilt is emotional, subjective, and inefficient. They operate on probability, And once the probability of you deviating again crossed an internal threshold, the system responded exactly as it was designed to. Calmly, automatically, without explanation. You didn't break any rules. You simply stopped fitting the model. Nothing changes all at once. That's how the system avoids panic. There's no message telling you that you've been marked, no status indicator flashing red, no official language to confirm what you already begin to sense. Life continues on the surface, almost convincingly normal, but beneath that surface, the pathways narrow. The first thing you notice is friction. Processes that once felt effortless now hesitate. Interfaces pause before responding. Applications take longer to load. Requests that used to pass silently now require confirmation, sometimes twice. You assume it's congestion, a system update, a temporary issue. Everyone assumes that at first. Then patterns emerge. Certain opportunities stop appearing altogether. Recommendations feel safer, more conservative. Routes adjust, avoiding complexity. Content is filtered toward neutrality, away from anything that might provoke strong reactions. Nothing is denied outright. It's just no longer offered. The system doesn't block doors. It simply stops opening them. Social interactions change in ways that are easy to miss. Invitations arrive later, if they arrive at all. Conversations feel shorter, more transactional. People don't avoid you. They just seem less available, less responsive, as if the system has quietly deprioritized your presence in their lives. You start second-guessing yourself. Am I imagining this? Did I do something wrong? Is this just how things are now? That uncertainty is intentional, because nothing feels officially wrong. There's no error message, no notice of restriction, no authority you can point to and say, this is where it changed. The system remains polite, functional, efficient. It still works for you, just not as well. Over time, the disappearance of options becomes harder to ignore. Career paths narrow, choices feel pre-selected. The future, once open-ended, begins to resemble a corridor with fewer doors and more signs pointing forward. You are still free, but only within boundaries you didn't agree to and can't see. That's what life after the flag looks like. Not punishment, not exclusion. Just a gradual reduction in how much the system is willing to imagine for you. And the most disturbing part is how quickly you adapt. Because adapting feels easier than asking questions the system no longer seems interested in answering. The cost of looking away. Attention didn't become mandatory because people were careless. It became mandatory because attention was measurable. In a world built on prediction, anything that can't be measured becomes a liability. And nothing reveals more about a person, more quickly and more reliably, than where they choose to look. So, attention became the currency of trust. If the system could see your eyes, it could estimate your intentions. If it could predict your intentions, it could manage risk. And if it could manage risk, it could justify control, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. That logic didn't require malice. It only required scale. There was a time when freedom meant the ability to look away, to let your eyes wander, to sit in silence without being interpreted, to disengage without consequence. Those moments of inattention weren't signs of danger. They were signs of being human. They allowed reflection, creativity, rest. They allowed choice. But systems that demand constant focus don't value choice, they value stability. Looking away became costly not because it was wrong, but because it introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing predictive systems are designed to eliminate. So the gaze was captured, the pause was monitored, the blink was measured, not to punish, but to optimize. And that is the final truth about systems that demand your attention. They don't need you to agree with them. They don't need you to understand them. They don't even need you to obey them consciously. They only need you to keep looking, because the moment you stop, the moment you look away, is the moment the system learns that you still remember what freedom used to feel like.